There's a particular kind of invisibility that exists only in the digital age. You scroll through your feeds, and everyone you know is there, documenting their meals, their travels, their milestones, their ordinary Tuesdays made extraordinary through careful framing and flattering light. And then there are the ones who aren't there, the ones whose last post was months or years ago if they ever posted at all, the ones who exist in your life but not on your screen, who are present in the room but absent from the algorithm. In a culture that has quietly redefined existence as visibility, these people look like they've opted out of living. They look avoidant, strange, perhaps sad, perhaps hiding something. But look more closely and what you'll often find isn't absence. It's a different kind of presence, a relationship with the world that doesn't require an audience, a way of inhabiting life that predates the need for anyone else to witness it. This isn't a simple story about introversion or shyness. It's a story about what happens when a person refuses to perform their existence for public consumption. And the psychology behind that refusal is more layered, more interesting, and more revealing than 5 quick bullet points can capture. Let's start with what social media actually is. Beneath the branding and the corporate language, it's a system designed to capture and monetize attention. Every feature, every notification, every algorithmic nudge exists because your attention is the product being sold. And to sell attention, you have to first create the need for it. You have to make people feel that being seen matters, that being watched validates, that existence without documentation is somehow incomplete. This is not a neutral environment. It's a deliberately engineered one. And understanding that engineering matters because the people who don't participate aren't just making a lifestyle choice. They're refusing to engage with a system that was specifically designed to be psychologically compelling. That refusal requires something. It requires either an awareness of what the system is doing that most people lack, or an internal stability that makes the system's rewards irrelevant. Either way, it's worth examining. Because in a world where participation is treated as default and abstention is treated as aberration, the people who opt out are telling us something important. Not just about themselves, but about what the rest of us have accepted without questioning. The psychology of why people post on social media is well documented. Social comparison theory, the need for external validation, the dopamine response to likes and comments. These are real mechanisms, they're powerful. And they shape behavior at a level that most people don't consciously recognize. You post a photo, you feel a brief spike of anxiety about whether it will be received well, and then the likes come in and you feel validated. This cycle is addictive, it's designed to be, and most people are inside it without realizing they're inside it. The people who don't post are the ones who, for whatever reason, aren't captured by this cycle. Maybe they never were. Maybe they were once and broke free. Maybe they tried and found it hollow. Maybe they simply never developed the habit. But the result is the same. They live outside a system that billions of people live inside. And that outside position gives them access to something the rest of us have mostly lost. Let's examine the first and most obvious reason people stop posting or never start. They find it hollow. They tried it. They posted. They watched for likes. They curated. They performed. And somewhere in that performance, they noticed a growing disconnect between the life they were showing and the life they were actually living. This disconnect is real. Psychologists have documented it extensively. The act of photographing an experience actually changes how you experience it. When you're documenting a moment, you're shifting your attention from the moment itself to its representation. You're not fully there. You're already thinking about how it will look, how it will be perceived, what it will communicate about you. And that shift, subtle as it is, leaches something essential from the experience itself. The people who stop posting often describe this as a kind of waking up. They realize they've been living their life one step removed, that they've been collecting experiences to display rather than having them fully, that the most beautiful sunset they ever saw was ruined because they spent it trying to capture it on their phone, that the most meaningful conversation they ever had was diminished because part of their attention was already composing the Instagram story about it. This recognition can happen suddenly or gradually, but once it happens, going back is difficult because you can't unsee the performance. You can't unknow that you were living for the audience rather than for yourself. The hollow feeling becomes permanent if you keep participating, so you stop. But it's worth noting that this isn't just about the moment-to-moment experience, it's about identity. When you curate an online presence, you're constructing a self, a particular version of yourself that you present to the world. And that constructed self requires maintenance. You have to keep feeding it content, keep updating it, keep making sure it stays coherent with the image you've built. And that maintenance becomes its own kind of labor. A second job of self-presentation that runs parallel to your actual life. The people who don't post have freed themselves from this labor. They don't maintain a public self. They don't perform for an audience. They don't spend mental energy crafting a narrative about who they are and what their life looks like. They just live. And the energy that would have gone into performance goes elsewhere, into actual relationships, into work that matters, into the quiet, unfilmed moments that make up most of what life actually is. Now let's talk about something more psychologically complex, the relationship between social media and self-concept, because this is where the non-posters reveal something genuinely interesting about how identity works. Most people develop and maintain their sense of self partly through external feedback. We figure out who we are by seeing how others respond to us. This is normal. It's how identity forms in childhood through the mirror of other people's reactions. But social media has turbocharged this process. It's created a constant quantified feedback loop, not just occasional reactions from people close to you, but numerical data about your worth delivered dozens of times a day. Likes, comments, shares, followers. These numbers become proxies for value, and most people, whether they'd admit it or not, calibrate their sense of self against them. The non-posters have a different relationship to identity. They either never built their self-concept on external feedback, or they've dismantled that dependency. Their sense of who they are doesn't come from the audience. It comes from somewhere internal, from their values, their relationships, their private experience of their own life. And this internal source of identity is, psychologically speaking, far more stable. Research on self-determination theory supports this. People whose sense of meaning comes from intrinsic sources, from internal values and autonomous choice, are significantly more psychologically resilient than those whose sense of meaning comes from extrinsic validation. They're less susceptible to anxiety, less prone to depression, more capable of handling setbacks without their entire sense of self collapsing. This doesn't mean they're immune to social pressure. No one is entirely independent of others' perceptions, but they have a baseline that doesn't require maintenance from the outside. They can go days, weeks without anyone, acknowledging their existence publicly, and still feel whole, still feel grounded, still know who they are. That kind of internal stability is genuinely rare in our current cultural moment, and it's worth examining closely. But let's not romanticize this too thoroughly, because not everyone who avoids posting does so from a place of psychological health. Some avoid it from anxiety, from fear of judgment, from a belief that they're not interesting enough, attractive enough, successful enough to be seen. This isn't confidence, it's its shadow, and the behaviors can look identical from the outside. The anxious non-poster and the grounded non-poster both have empty feeds, but their inner worlds couldn't be more different. The anxious non-poster is hyper-aware of social media. They scroll constantly, consuming what others produce while producing nothing themselves. They compare They measure their life against the curated highlights they see. They feel inadequate. They've opted out of posting not because they've transcended the need for validation, but because they don't believe they can win the game. The grounded non-poster has genuinely disengaged from the game itself. They don't scroll to compare. They don't measure their life against others' performances. They've stepped outside the frame entirely, not just stopped playing. Distinguishing between these two profiles matters, because the prescription is completely different. The anxious non-poster needs to examine their relationship to social media consumption, not just production. They need to address the underlying self-doubt that keeps them scrolling while preventing them from participating. The grounded non-poster has already done this work. They need nothing from the system. They're simply living elsewhere. And there's a third profile that's rarely discussed, the strategic non-poster, someone who has consciously decided that their visibility serves them better through other channels, that social media attention isn't the kind of attention they want or need, that their work, their relationships, their influence operates on different terrain. These people aren't avoiding social media because it threatens them or because they've transcended it. They've simply assessed it and found it irrelevant to their actual life and goals. For them, not posting isn't a statement. It's just what makes sense. All three profiles look the same online. Empty feeds, no photos, no updates, but they represent fundamentally different psychological realities. And understanding which profile you're looking at or which profile you are requires a level of self-examination that the culture of social media actively discourages. Let's talk about what non-posting actually protects, because there's a cost to posting that most people absorb without realizing it. And understanding that cost illuminates why opting out might be healthier than it appears. The first cost is cognitive. Every time you post something, you're making a micro decision about how to represent yourself, what angle to use, what filter to apply, what caption to write, what impression to create. These seem like small decisions, but they accumulate. Decision fatigue is real, and the constant, low-grade cognitive labor of self-presentation drains mental resources that could be directed toward more meaningful thinking. Non-posters reclaim this cognitive space. They don't think about how their life looks to others because others can't see it. This frees up mental bandwidth for deeper engagement with their actual experience. They can think about what something means rather than how it will appear. They can process their emotions without simultaneously performing them for an audience. They can be genuinely confused or uncertain or in the middle of figuring something out without feeling pressure to present a coherent narrative about their life. The second cost is emotional. Social media creates a perpetual vulnerability loop. You put something out. You wait for a response. The response validates or it doesn't. And either way, you've made yourself briefly exposed, briefly vulnerable to the judgment of others. Repeat this dozens of times a day, and your baseline emotional state shifts. You become more anxious, more reactive to how others perceive you, more dependent on external signals of worth. Non-posters don't cycle through this loop. Their emotional regulation is less contaminated by others' reactions. They can feel good about something without needing confirmation. They can feel bad about something without broadcasting it. Their inner world remains private, which means it remains theirs. And there's a psychological freedom in that ownership that's increasingly rare. The third cost is relational. Social media creates a particular kind of relationship, parasocial, one-directional, based on performance rather than presence. When your primary mode of connection with people is through curated posts, your actual relationships suffer. You confuse knowing someone's highlight reel with knowing them. You substitute digital acknowledgement for genuine encounter. Non-posters maintain relationships through older, more authentic channels, face-to-face conversation, phone calls, letters even. These channels require more effort but produce deeper connection. They can't be optimized. They can't be performed for an audience. They require you to show up as yourself, imperfect and unfiltered, and engage with another person who's doing the same. And that kind of engagement, however inconvenient, is what human relationships were actually built for. Let's examine something that the quick psychological breakdowns miss entirely: the way social media has fundamentally altered our relationship to memory and experience. Because this is where non-posting becomes not just a lifestyle choice, but a form of cognitive preservation. When you photograph something, your brain registers that the documentation exists and partially releases the obligation to remember it itself. This is called the photo-taking impairment effect, documented extensively in cognitive psychology research. The act of capturing something externally reduces your brain's motivation to encode it internally. You're not just failing to be present, you're actively weakening your capacity to remember what happened. Non-posters don't create this shortcut. Their experiences go directly into memory without the mediation of documentation. They remember their vacations more vividly. They recall conversations more accurately. The emotional texture of significant moments stays with them longer because their brain was fully engaged in encoding them rather than delegating that task to a photo album. There's something important here about how we relate to our own lives. When everything is documented, life becomes a series of productions, events that are partly for living and partly for recording. But when nothing is documented, or very little is, life is just life. It's just happening. And you're just there, fully in it, no audience, no performance, just the raw, unmediated experience of being alive in a moment that will never happen again. This is increasingly rare, and it might be more psychologically valuable than most people realize, because there's a relationship between presence and meaning. Moments that are fully inhabited feel more significant than moments that are half experienced while being documented. The non-poster's life, unglamorous as it might look from the outside, might actually be richer in subjective experience than the carefully curated life that fills most people's feeds. Let's also address the social dimension, because one of the criticisms leveled at non-posters is that they're antisocial, that they don't care about connection, that their absence from social media reflects some kind of emotional unavailability. This criticism misunderstands what social connection actually requires. Social media creates the appearance of connection, lots of it. You have hundreds of followers, you comment on dozens of posts, you're in touch with people you haven't spoken to in years. But this isn't connection, it's contact. It's the thin simulation of connection that social media provides. And it can actually substitute for the real thing if you let it. Non-posters are often forced, by their absence from the digital social landscape, to invest more heavily in actual relationships. They can't maintain the illusion of connection through likes and comments. If they want to know how someone is doing, they have to ask directly. If they want to stay in someone's life, they have to show up physically or invest the effort that real communication requires. Their social world is smaller, but that's often by choice. And what it lacks in breadth, it typically makes up for in depth. Research on relationship quality consistently shows that the number of social connections matters less than the quality of those connections. A person with 3 deep, genuine friendships is psychologically healthier than a person with 300 superficial online connections, and non-posters tend to have more of the former, precisely because they've never invested in the latter. They never had the digital shortcut, so they built the real thing. This doesn't mean every non-poster has a rich social life. Some are genuinely isolated, and their absence from social media reflects that isolation rather than an alternative form of engagement. But for many, the invisibility online coexists with a quiet, rich social world that exists entirely off-screen. The kind of relationships that don't generate content, that don't produce shareable moments, that exist in kitchens and living rooms and long walks and phone calls that no one else witnesses. Let's talk about what happens culturally when more and more people stop posting, because this isn't just an individual psychology question, it's a collective one. And as the generation that grew up on social media begins to recognize its costs, we're seeing a shift that's worth paying attention to. The backlash against social media posting has been building for years. It started with the wellness community, people who recognized the mental health costs early and began advocating for digital detox. It moved into mainstream culture, where even some influencers started posting about the toxicity of the platform they built their careers on. And now it's becoming a broader cultural movement, particularly among younger adults who are questioning whether the attention economy deserves their participation. This shift has implications that go beyond individual well-being, because social media as a system depends on participation. It needs content producers to function. It needs people to post so that other people have something to consume. When significant numbers of people stop producing content, the system's power diminishes. Its ability to shape perception, influence behavior, and monetize attention all depend on people continuing to feed it. The non-poster in this context isn't just making a personal choice. They're withdrawing from an economic system. They're depriving a platform of the raw material it needs to function. And while one person's absence doesn't meaningfully impact the system, collective absence does. Every person who stops posting is a vote against the way we've organized public life around digital performance. This makes the non-poster, paradoxically, more politically significant than the prolific poster, because the prolific poster is participating in the system, regardless of what they post or how critically they frame it. But the non-poster is withholding participation entirely, and in a system built on participation, that withholding is disruption. Let's circle back to the individual, though, because ultimately, whatever the cultural implications, this is about how a person has chosen to live their life. And that choice deserves to be understood on its own terms, not just through the lens of what it signals or what it reveals about psychology. Some people simply don't want to be watched. This isn't anxiety and it isn't confidence. It's a preference. A genuine, considered preference for privacy that predates social media by thousands of years. People have always had the choice of how much of themselves to make public. Social media just made the public option so dominant that the private option started to look abnormal. But it's not abnormal, it's ancient. For most of human history, your life was known only to the people you actually interacted with. Your face was seen only by people who were physically present. Your experiences were shared only with those who were there or those you chose to tell. The idea that your existence should be broadcast to hundreds or thousands of people would have been incomprehensible to every generation before ours. The non-poster is simply maintaining a relationship with privacy that used to be universal. They haven't rejected the world, they've just declined to perform for it. And in the current climate, that declination requires more deliberateness than participation does. It's not the path of least resistance. It's a choice, a conscious one that says, this life is mine, not for display, not for consumption, not for algorithmic distribution, mine to be lived rather than documented, experienced rather than shared, kept rather than broadcast. There's one more thing worth addressing, the judgment that non-posters often receive, the raised eyebrows, the questions, you don't have Instagram? Really? Are you hiding something? Do you not have any friends? These questions reveal more about the asker than the person being asked, because they assume that normal, healthy social behavior includes digital self-presentation, that opting out of that self-presentation is inherently suspicious. This assumption deserves to be questioned, because it's only about a decade old. Before social media, no one would have asked these questions. No one would have assumed that a person who didn't advertise their existence was deficient in some way. The expectation of digital visibility is new, and new expectations aren't automatically valid ones. The people who don't post aren't broken. They're not hiding. They're not antisocial. They're not sad or lonely or incapable of connection. Most of the time, they're simply living a life that doesn't require witnesses, a life that's complete without an audience, a life that existed before the feed and will exist after it. In a culture increasingly addicted to being seen, perhaps the most radical act is simply choosing not to be. Not as rebellion, not as statement, just as a quiet, considered decision about how to spend the limited time you have being alive, to spend it experiencing rather than performing, to spend it being rather than appearing, to spend it in the one place no algorithm can reach and no audience can follow, inside your own life, as it actually is, not as it could be filtered, framed, and fed. They don't need to be seen to feel seen. They don't need to be watched to know they're here. And in a world increasingly built around the performance of existence, that might be the quietest form of freedom left.